I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Christina Cameron. Among her many career achievements, Christina has been involved with the UNESCO World Heritage Committee since 1987, and she has been chair twice. She worked with cultural resources for Parks Canada for more than 30 years and now has a career in academia. Now, yesterday, Mechtild Rossler introduced cultural landscapes at the World Heritage Sites, and today Christina is going to continue and talk about the evolution of cultural landscapes as World Heritage Sites, where we've been, but also where we need to go in the future. So please welcome Christina Cameron. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope this microphone doesn't start to spit and hum and all the things it's been doing. I wanted to begin by thanking Archer St. Clair and the Rutgers program for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. It sounded like a great day, and I'm really pleased with what I've heard today, so I hope that I can contribute to the discussion. You see the title of my talk, Entre, Chien et Loup, World Heritage Cultural Landscapes on the 40th Anniversary. What I'm going to do is build a bit on what Mechtild did, as far as I understand it, since I didn't see it, and take a look at the road traveled on cultural landscapes through that 40 years, where we have got to so far, and some of the challenges on the way forward. And the reason why, okay, hang on, see if I can do this. Yes. The reason why I chose this title, Entre chien et loup, which is between the dog and the wolf, this is a very old French expression. It means dusk. It's the time when you can't tell whether it's a dog or a wolf. And that's, it's 1,000 years old, this expression. But people say, well, I don't know, I can't really tell anymore, it's Entre chien et loup. So the reason I chose that is I think that's kind of where we are with cultural landscapes. And for me, it's a bit the what, and it's not clear what the what is, and therefore it's not so clear how we can manage the what if we don't know what the what is. And I'm going to proceed through my short presentation a bit on that theme. So the road to the cultural landscape world came from two different distinct lines. Some of you know this history. The one line, and I've chosen to go before 1965 and bring you up through this process. On the natural heritage side, the roots really come in the creation of IUCN in 1948, which was facilitated by UNESCO. And in fact, the production of the very first list that is kind of like a World Heritage List, which is in 1962, and it was in the UN system, but not in World Heritage, which didn't exist. And that list of protected areas and equivalent reserves, the one point I would make today is that it was not limited to natural sites. It also had cultural sites, including rice terraces, and it had Angkor and various things that were in a park-like setting. So that's one route. The other route is the cultural side, coming up through UNESCO. And UNESCO in 1951 created an international group of cultural heritage experts to see what to do in this world, in that area. And two of the things they did, first they created contributed to the creation of a couple of institutions, ICROM, which was a kind of operational conservation arm on an international basis, in 1956, and then ICOMOS in 1965, which was more on the doctrine side. So, and they were focusing on cultural heritage as historical monuments and archaeological sites, but they also were interested in landscapes, and I think Mechtild talked about the early landscape interest. The reason I chose 1965 is known to some of you, and that is the year of the famous meeting conference at the White House, in which there were, on the 20th anniversary of the UN system, there were, I think, about 30 different committees working on international cooperation, including this one, on natural resources conservation and development. That is where there was a proposal for a World Heritage Trust. That's the first time that those words came. And I won't go into all the details of that citation, except to say it has all the elements of the World Heritage Convention in that short paragraph. And I point to scenic areas, which is this crossover between cultural heritage and natural heritage. So that was kind of already on the radar. I won't go through the elaboration of all these convention texts, but what happened after that is there were two separate convention texts being worked on, one through IUCN and the other under UNESCO. And unbelievably, several years went by, and the natural resources people at UNESCO knew about the IUCN one, and the cultural resource people, of course, knew about the cultural one, but they didn't know, they never talked to each other, even though they were both in the same institution. So much for bureaucratic silos. But what I would say in both of those texts, one had big nature, small culture, as you can see, the other big culture, small nature. Near the end, the Americans put in a third draft text, and it was sort of equal culture and nature. And this all went through a process towards Stockholm, which forced the issue of bringing them all into one. And that, won't go into that because I'm afraid for time. And it led to the creation of the World Heritage Convention. But what I would say is that it was a kind of a force fit between culture and nature. And that's the piece to retain here, is it wasn't, everyone was, all parties kind of were talking culture and nature, but there was a gap in the system because their perception of nature was different. And the gap was really landscape in the European sense of landscape. That was the part that was sitting in the middle. And then, as it started to be implemented, the forces that were implementing it actually were working towards separating it. And at UNESCO, there were two bureaucracies that really didn't have much to do with each other, and that's pretty clear from the research I've been doing. They were really siloed. In the advisory bodies, there were two advisories on culture and one on nature. The tendency on both sides, but particularly on the IUCN side, was the people who were early on working in the natural side were very strong on pristine wilderness, in quotations, and not so interested in cultural landscapes or that place in between. So even though there were good intentions, and it is a stroke of genius of the convention to have put the two together, on the other hand, there were a lot of forces pulling it apart. And some of you know that I've been working with Mechtilde on a project on the history of the World Heritage Convention. We've been working with documents, but also with interviews with pioneers. And I just show you some of the faces because this really brings the human dimension to it. We've done 38 interviews, and 5 of the people we've interviewed since 2006, 5 of them have passed on, so it really shows the value of capturing this voice before it disappears. I want to focus on 3 at the moment. Madame Vlad Borelli from Italy, who chaired the 1983 meeting, Mr. Chabasson from France, who was the rapporteur in 1984, and Mr. Presweer, who was the ICOMOS coordinator and advisor and evaluator of nominations for 10 years from 1980 to 1990. And it's this road from rural landscapes to cultural landscapes. And basically, the European concept of human transformation of the land over centuries for living purposes and for subsistence, it essentially modified the ecosystems. And this was the piece that wasn't finding any place in the convention. And so in 1984, Mr. Chabasson introduced the idea of rural landscapes. And he said, rice terraces and vineyards respond to the spirit of the convention and a site of water and land, not a work of art. So this was that's where he was coming from. And then Jane Robertson, who was the UNESCO bureaucrat who wrote up the minutes of that meeting, said her memory was it wasn't savage nature, wilderness nature, and it wasn't the churches, it was something in between, which is the World Heritage value. This is this gap thing. I won't read Madame Vlad Borelli in all her detail, but these were the kinds of sites she was thinking of, and what to retain is humanized landscapes. She calls them paysages anthropisés, that's it. But the one, Les Poules, is really the Hannibal battle, and so we have already, in her mind, it was places of memory and so on. In 1987, with no explanation, and nobody really knows why, they suddenly became cultural landscapes in the minutes of the World Heritage Committee meetings. Mr. Chabasson's explanation is that there wasn't a place for rural because the convention talked about cultural and natural, and so they had to go with cultural. That's what he thinks, but then he adds very clearly that it was kind of the anthropologists who controlled UNESCO, and they really wanted to have this word cultural, but it actually changed very much the sense of where this started. He was opposed and continues to be opposed to the shift to cultural landscapes because for him, terraced landscapes are not cultural landscapes, but rural landscapes, and I think this really has to do essentially with sites versus ecosystems. I think this is where you get the perception that it is a site with a boundary, and it really, in a way, ties you up with the distortion, in a way, that the World Heritage Convention imposes by requiring, through a designation process, requiring boundaries. I think this is part of one of the shift areas that's really difficult to get a grasp on. And of course, we've been talking about that today, about the ambiguity, because the focus shifts to ecosystems and living cultures within them. And we've had lots of discussion of that. Mr. Pressware, who was working with the United Kingdom to look at the Lake District as the typical example, or the pilot project to try and sort out this concept, was very insulted that the committee turned it down. Twice, if not 3 times, I'm not sure how many times. And for him, it was a question of that people didn't know that it was easy to manage monuments and it was not easy to manage fragile landscapes. So this is where he felt really quite strongly about that. The paradigm shift, I think, is in 1992. First of all, we have the meeting at La Petite Pierre, and we have the approval by the World Heritage Committee at the meeting in Santa Fe in 1992, so it's all that same year, of the 3 types, the established types, and I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm pretty sure someone presented them, right. But what is also interesting is that is the year of the creation of the World Heritage Center, which brought together nature and culture into one bureaucracy in UNESCO. So that's another part of the shift, I think. And the third element, it is the year of the Convention on Biodiversity. So I think what you're seeing, I think, is in 1992, I mean, people tend to see these conventions in isolation, but I think what you're seeing there is exactly the influence of the zeitgeist of the time, of a real shift towards a sense of ecosystem view of land. But the convention remains with this hard definition of a site, and so there's a pull there. So for me, the World Heritage Cultural Landscapes, when I say Entre, chien, loup, what I'm really thinking about is the complexity, the number of complexities related to where we are now. And one is capturing what is of outstanding universal value, first of all, but then, because this is a system, and it doesn't, there's always discussion about then what about local values and other values. So that's the first piece. The second piece is what are the attributes that support the outstanding universal value, but the attributes then, it's not about necessarily about physical things, it's about intangible things, it's about living societies. And then if the obligation under the World Heritage Convention is to protect, how do you protect? What is the management framework for living societies when it's evident that living societies continue to evolve? So I think it makes it really quite complicated for people. And we heard Miriam talk about how do you go about managing this huge cultural landscape when it's continuing to evolve. And that really challenges, I think, heritage professionals who are trained traditionally in sort of something that is much more controllable. I think now we're looking at all sorts of expertise that people who grew up in this business don't possess. The second confusion that I see is the confusion between typology, which I think you could argue the rural landscapes was a typology. What was being thought of was a typology. And what is now talked about as a cultural landscape approach, which is really to do with well, it's really what Randall Mason said about, you know, the way you see all places. And it has to do with interaction with communities, has to do with all the participation and the shared values and the building up of values in a system where you actually have values that are parachuted in from the top. So there's some issues around that. But under the historic urban landscapes recommendation, we talk about a cultural landscape approach. And so there is, in my mind, a debate about, is it a typology, is it an approach, is it both, and how do you sort those two things out? And so when I look at World Heritage Cultural Landscapes at 40, I guess I would say it didn't begin as a way of seeing places. It began as a way to bridge a gap between the culture and nature, that piece, the piece in between. So it didn't start on a philosophical basis of cultural landscape view, but there was this paradigm shift, and I actually think that's one of the great achievements of the World Heritage Convention, that it brought all of those issues to the table, and over many years, because you saw the rural landscape beginning was 1984, the cultural landscape kind of acceptance was 1992. That was 8 years of discussion about how this could work. And I think that really is one of the great achievements of the convention. And it's not on a local or national scale, it's on a global scale. But I think we're still working out the details. I think there are still quite a few things that are confusing, and that it's hard for countries to figure out exactly what they're doing in terms of identification and in terms of management. And in a way, I was thinking Julian said that the historic urban landscapes tools are in their infancy. I think the tools for cultural landscape, especially management, actually, the ongoing management, I think those tools are kind of in their infancy. So that's why I chose the title Entre, chien, loup. I think it's not quite clear yet. I think that there's been a huge leap forward, but there's still a way to go. And if I had a recommendation for future, is to keep having this kind of discussion and keep working on it, because I don't think we're quite there yet. But we've made huge progress. So that was really my message. Am I on time? Okay. Yes, I did it. Yes, I'll stay. Okay, you go ahead. Oh.
Thank you, Christina. Are there any questions? Yes, indeed. Let's start off with Barb. Can you...
So to get there, to continue the conversation, should we need to have some of our natural resource friends join us in this? Because, you know, in this country, the Nature Conservancy is sort of the big dog out there. And I've been eating their dust for 20 years. So maybe they need to be part of this. And, whether it's around Crown of the Continent, which we heard about earlier from Brenda, or some of the other landscapes, they're very now involved in identifying landscapes in the Northeast. They have much better science, I know, in details about what's out there than I think we have in terms of what some of the cultural and historic resources are. But it seems like we ought to invite them to the party.
Yeah, I would say that many more than just the people who work in particularly natural resource conservation. I think that the discussion is a much broader discussion than that, but I do understand your comment. I should say, because I did say at the beginning that IUCN was very reluctant in the early years. I would say there was, within IUCN, there was a shift at about the same time, and that they really did, there were different people who became involved, particularly a man who's dead now, Bing Lucas from New Zealand, who was a wonderful man and a very thoughtful, understood cultural landscapes, came from a natural park background. And so there has been a lot more dialogue. But I come from the cultural heritage side of the national parks, or the Park Service in Canada too. And that has been always it's been a hard bridge. And again, they start in silos. There's an act for, I don't know if you have different acts as well. We have a National Parks Act, and we have a National Historic Sites Act, and we have silos as well. So that's, but yes, I think we need to have a much broader conversation.
Let's go with Jessica next.
Jessica Brown with the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and I chair a working group on protected landscapes. And so I guess we're part of that other group running along the river that Brenda showed us. And I think one thing I want to mention, because we haven't heard about it here, is we've talked a lot about designations. We haven't talked about Category 5 in IUCN's system of protected areas. But there is growing application of that management category in many countries, and if there had been time in the other panel, I would have been asked either George or Guillermo to speak to that. We're seeing it as not just a European category, though that is where it began, but certainly people like Bing Lucas brought that to the fore in Oceania. And so I would say actually some of the tools for management of cultural landscapes come out of the nature conservation protected areas world in categories like Category 5. And we have fought hard in the nature conservation world to get our colleagues to take on board the importance of cultural value. So when I come to meetings like this, I feel very much like I'm in a parallel universe. I think the convergence is incredible. The bridges are there. One reason our nature conservation colleagues, and we tried very hard to get some here, are not here is because this is the meeting, this is the conference of parties of the CBD right now. So and I think that even speaks to the fact that we operate in these different tracks and we don't necessarily even find those opportunities. But several of us, Guillermo being one, were just at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Jeju, South Korea. It happens every 4 years. It brought together some 5,000 or 6,000 people, as well as another several thousand people who must have been part of the Korean National Park Service. And themes that were explored there. Resilience was the overarching term, and so again, a topic that we're hearing here. But themes that were explored there that were highly relevant, I think, to what we're talking about were the connection with food security, food sovereignty, and traditional agricultural landscapes, governance, and the involvement of communities in managing protected areas. And one of the things I would say is, okay, just one more point. One thing to keep your eye on in the nature conservation world, because it parallels what we're talking about here, is connectivity. Connectivity conservation is driving these large-scale conservation efforts that Brenda spoke about. And within that framework, there is no way to ignore culture. So that's one of those bridges across the river.
Yes, I agree that a conversation with both the Convention on Biodiversity and also the Food and Agriculture Organization, which are very involved in protecting traditional food-growing landscapes. But the point I wanted to make on the CBD was that the usefulness of the guidelines for involvement of Aboriginal people in the management and protection of ecosystems. I think that's really an important element that hasn't been brought back into this discussion.
We have 5 minutes. George, I'm going to pass by you just for the moment to see if there's anybody else who hasn't gotten something off their chest to say it while they can. Monica.
Hello, Christine. Thank you for your talk. It was really an excellent resume. But I would like to ask you. Do you think that during this 20 years of cultural landscapes have been really well implemented? I mean, has it been a good effect than the inscription, or has it prevented their evolution?
The question is, the designated cultural landscapes over the last 20 years, has that been good for them or has it slowed down their evolution? I don't know, because I don't know enough about the specific cases, but my instinct tells me that it's going to work against them over time, and I'm worried about that because there's the concept of designating and putting boundaries around a site when a landscape is really so personal in a way, and it's experienced by different people in different ways, and the values are very broad and different depending on who you are and what community you are and so on. And I don't know where the boundaries are. And also you can't freeze, or you have to make a lot of room for the evolution of activity in those landscapes. So I don't know. I don't know. I've been to a couple where I think it has kind of frozen, and there's a kind of they've become, actually the word was used this morning, curatorial. They've become like big sites in a way, and that's not so good. So I don't know the answer to that, but it is, from a theoretical point of view, it seems that could be a threat.
Any other questions? And George has a question. Please go ahead, George.
George, nobody believes you. I think that the view that Mr. Chabasson gave of why that shifted, I think he hasn't got the full view. That would be my take, because I think that cultural landscapes is much more than just a shift from rural landscape to just a different name. I was really reflecting what he had said. I think that the cultural landscapes were seen as a tool, part of the global strategy, something that could move away from monumental sites something that could have strong associative value, in fact, very little physical evidence, and some of the sites from your part of the world, in fact, came forward on that basis. So I think it actually, in a way, the theory of what happens and then how people use it, that makes it evolve also. And I think that the concept, I don't know if he's right or wrong about his rural landscape to cultural landscape, because cultural landscapes is so much bigger concept. But I can see that the cultural landscapes have been a support to the global strategy. That would be my view.
Okay. Jane.
Christina, I think also at the same time there was a change of criteria from dead cultures to living cultures, and so cultural landscape.
That was in the global strategy.
Okay. So
That's where some of those criteria changes were made, were there. That's why I think George is coming at it from the global strategy perspective, because that's where the living cultures was put there. But I think that the cultural landscapes has supported that shift.
I'm in the privileged position of letting my boss, Stephanie Toothman, have the last word here. Last question, Stephanie.
I would just refer you to Julian's image of the postmodern world with that circle. Yeah, I understand.
right, then we'll hear from Archer what the next step is today. Okay, thank you.